And other than that, I'd say in terms of the government side right now, on the currency level, we're at a point where the Naira is, like you said, funny money essentially. So one Naira is around like roughly zero point 0.9 sats. I think it's been kind of vibrating between the band of like 1 to 1 in terms of parity, which has been interesting for a lot of Bitcoiners on the ground because converting from sats to Naira is highly convenient. It's essentially the same unit.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
so there is that convenience, and honestly, just goes to show the pertinence of Bitcoin as an actual tool for folks on the ground in terms of being honestly at this point a replacement for the currency, which is not something that the government wants, and honestly no government should want.
Okay, welcome everybody to a new episode of Bitcoin Equities Talks. Today I have with me Abubakar, which is the CEO of Recursive Capital. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us about what you're doing in the Bitcoin space?
Thanks for having me, Judge. My name, as you mentioned, is Abubakar Nur Khalil. I'm the CEO of Recursive Capital, which is a Bitcoin VC that invests in Bitcoin companies with a specific focus in Africa. I'm also one of the 4 board members of BTrust, where we essentially train African Bitcoin developers through BTrust Builders, as well as give out grants through the main entity itself. I'm also a Nigerian Bitcoin core contributor, and I also recently released a Bitcoin wallet to kind of help fast track a lot of the adoption here on the ground in terms of building. And other than that, I pretty much help around the Bitcoin space wherever I can, essentially.
I don't know where to start with our interview because I've been hearing so much about you and I've been following what you've been doing in Nigeria. So perhaps can you tell us about your Bitcoin story or Bitcoin personal story, how you discovered it and how you became a Bitcoiner, basically?
For sure. The story was pretty, now in hindsight, is like one of those things where you're like, wow, I didn't think just reading a few articles would lead me up until the path I eventually had with Bitcoin. But initially in like 2017, started reading up more about Bitcoin. That was, I think, about the same time when the price was still mooning. So for me, honestly, it wasn't a case of like, this is freedom money or anything transcendental per se. It was just a case of this tech seemed really cool. I had no bank account at the time, so it was interesting for me to look at money from that perspective. So a lot of it for me was just tinkering around, reading up, and immediately it struck me that I didn't know exactly what I was reading. I had no technical background before then. I was fresh out of high school in 2016 after I graduated. So for me, I felt, okay, the time I had on my hands, I might as well use that to teach myself how to code, get a bit more technical. So by 2018, I started coding, started reading up a lot more technical material on Bitcoin. And then 2019 was when I first contributed to Bitcoin Core and been doing so ever since. So in general, I'd say the journey for me has been one of further entrenchment. The more I discovered not only the depth of Bitcoin, but kind of the real life use cases it had beyond even just remittances as just a financial tool for people, really, that's very useful, especially as we move forward from not only the 21st century, but in the next couple millennia, in my opinion, in the sense that it needs to be an essential of your toolkit for you to honestly just safeguard your sovereignty as a whole. So that was kind of the journey for me. And then over time, it became a case of like further entrenching myself as I felt I needed to contribute a lot more to the space given how nascent it was. So it started off with just purely being a developer all the way up to launching a fund in 2020 to help really efficiently allocate capital, as well as training developers back in 2021 as well with Gala, and then became BTrust Builders, and then my involvement with BTrust as well, giving out grants and things like this, all the way up to now where I wear multiple hats with like running Recursive Capital on the fund side, and then being one of the board members of BTrust, where we're helping with the general growth of the ecosystem. And then privately as well, I still write code and review PRs on Bitcoin Core, as well as even write articles for Forbes, just to kind of capture all the development on the ground, because a lot is happening. So I prioritize doing that and making sure people are aware of exactly what's going on and not just FUD.
Okay, the fact that you're based in Nigeria makes it quite unique for me to interview you, because Nigeria always pops up in the Bitcoin space on several levels. And I became like myself a Nigerian currency expert because of all the Twitter followings I have on Bitcoin related news and topics. And what I have seen is so many good things, but at the same time, so many bad things. So you have one of the highest adoption rate, if I'm not mistaken, in the world. but at the same time, it's the highest criminal rate also, or criminal use cases of Bitcoin, with scammers and all kind of stuff. Maybe you can educate me on this part. And at the same time, it's the most enforced. Bitcoin is almost illegal in area where you had Binance executives and then ending up in jail, and the government trying to chase local exchanges to shut down. And also at the same time, it's the worst currency in the world. It's a funny currency. The Naira has been every headline I have been following since I've been following Bitcoin in Nigeria is as if it was a joke. It's even in monopolies there are better rules than what I have seen in Nigeria. So can you explain to our audience some of the unique, basically, perspectives that you have being based there and having seen what your country have been through?
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, it was one of those things for me where I felt the more I got further entrenched in the Bitcoin space, obviously I was met with decisions of either leaving Nigeria because of the situation, especially on the government side, in terms of the perspective of folks involved in the Bitcoin space versus staying on the ground. And naturally for me, I felt would it make sense to kind of build for folks on the ground without necessarily being here on the ground. So that's why I prioritized staying in Nigeria, because I felt is the only way, honestly, for us to battle against the whole, for me, I feel is a misunderstanding on the government side. I don't feel that there's a ton of malicious intent on the government side, because I've had conversations with a lot of folks in the government and various agencies. So I can tell that it's a case of both misunderstanding, complete fear of the technology itself as a result of that misunderstanding, and just in general, trying to deal with a lot of economic challenges really head on without necessarily looking at kind of the wide range of effects that each economic measure has on the populace. So first few things, on the criminality side, I would say yes, in 2017 and 18, that was the initial introduction a lot of people had on the ground, especially all across Africa, really, with Bitcoin being introduced through a scammy method of Ponzi's and all that, where people were deceived and conned into thinking that others were buying Bitcoin on their behalf. And then after the price burst, a lot of people were asking, where's the Bitcoin that you bought me, quote unquote? And they realized that no one was buying any Bitcoin. People were just taking money and then just scamming. So a lot of that has honestly stopped on the ground. We haven't seen a huge rise in scams. I'd say it's more cyclical, and it's more in tandem with the price. So typically when we have a large price rise on the continent, we tend to see a lot of people running up a lot of these scams again of saying, oh, I want to buy Bitcoin for you, or maybe buy this quote unquote altcoin or shitcoin. And I'd say a lot of that has definitely not affected the overall adoption for Bitcoin. The problem we've seen is a lot of the scammers tend to pollute the waters, and a lot of the people that are quote unquote champions of the Bitcoin or wider crypto space have polluted the waters in terms of not finally categorizing each technology. So from my perspective, a lot of the work we've been doing over the last few years has been educating people to understand that there's Bitcoin and then there's everything else, which honestly are essentially just securities in terms of a legality standpoint or a regulatory framework standpoint. So a lot of that has been moving a lot of the government perspective towards that so that it could be regulated accordingly. So for us, a lot of the moves have been around regulating Bitcoin more as a commodity as opposed to a security, for example, because we don't feel that it just gel with a lot of the regulatory frameworks. And other than that, I'd say in terms of the government side right now, on the currency level, we're at a point where the Naira is, like you said, funny money, essentially. So one Naira is around roughly 0.9 sats. I think it's been kind of vibrating between the band of 1 to 1 in terms of parity, which has been interesting for a lot of Bitcoiners on the ground because converting from sats to Naira is highly convenient. It's actually the same unit.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
So there is that convenience. And honestly, just goes to show the pertinence of Bitcoin as an actual tool for folks on the ground in terms of being honestly, at this point, a replacement for the currency, which is not something that the government wants. And honestly, no government should want in terms of having your currency devalued to the point where it's on par with currency that has 8 decimal places. So for a lot of them, they're trying to, on the government side, sort out framework that are effective enough to curtail all the economic challenges that we're facing, both in terms of inflation, the food crisis that we have on the ground, the currency issue we have with regards to Forex and the US dollar rates. And So a lot of it has been trying to make sure that they understand exactly the benefits of allowing for Bitcoin to proliferate, even on the economic side. Because I firmly believe the more that they try to clamp down on Bitcoin, the more that there will be a lot more adverse economic effects, really, from shutting down Naira pairs on the P2P side and things like that. And the truth is, it's more of an uphill battle on the government side, because for them to really shut down Bitcoin will require shutting down almost every financial rail on in the country. So I don't think that would make a lot of economic sense for them to go about it that way. And there are a lot of verticals that we've seen other governments embrace, from Ethiopia to Kenya, in terms of Bitcoin mining, solving a lot of electrification issues, grid stabilization, which has been a high priority for us here in Nigeria since the 90s, honestly, in terms of a lack of proper infrastructure on the electric grid side, and due to the distribution companies and all of that. So I do feel that, all in all, suffice to say, I think moving forward, the best trajectory for the country as a whole would be to further embrace Bitcoin, because we've already seen that no bans can shut down Bitcoin. And in fact, I'd argue the opposite, which is a lot of the bans since 2021 to date and all the reversals have just further increased the awareness for people to jump to Bitcoin as a better money than the national currency, which they really want to sort out a lot of the economic challenges. We just have to open up the markets and allow for natural economics to take charge, really, and center stage. So I feel for a lot of them, it would be a case of just helping unlearn a lot of the preconceived notions that they have about Bitcoin, and letting them understand that, hey, look around. A lot of the world's already embracing this. For you to remain economically competitive, even on a global stage, you'll have to allow for these markets to proliferate. So that's really essentially kind of the situation we're in. It's a bit precarious, obviously, like you mentioned with the Binance situation, but for a lot of us on the ground, we understand that this is just as a result of just the government fearing exactly what Bitcoin is, as opposed to just hating innovation or not wanting economic freedom for their indigents.
Okay, and how do you explain such a high penetration rate in Nigeria compared to the rest of the world and the rest of Africa? Is it mainly due because of the failure of the Naira, or are there other reasons why it has such a high penetration rate?
There are a variety of reasons. I'd say chief among them would be, first and foremost, the Naira itself. Because one thing I noticed is the more we kept devaluing the national currency, the more the inflation rates kept rising, the more we had even the crisis recently of last year, where we had essentially four Nairas, where we had the banknotes, we had the actual physical old and new notes, because we were transitioning to soak up all the extant cash that was outside of banks, because a lot of the economic policies were not effective because cash was outside of banks. So regulation was a lot more terse, really, on their end. So we saw a lot of that. And then we saw also, as a result of a lot of that, the combination with the ENR as well, and kind of the push they've had, which has been unsuccessful for obvious reasons, being that the national currency itself has already been viewed by a lot of Nigerians as failing. So a digital version of it that's less fungible, because no one accepts that ENR, doesn't make a lot of economic sense for them to switch through. And especially in times of crisis that we already have with regards to the high inflation rates, food crisis, and all that, a lot of people are not thinking, I'd like to have a even more inefficient version of the Naira as a means of exchange, both on the ground and above and that. I'd say so. A lot of that has contributed to people seeking out an alternative, whether it's USDT or like even real estate, or more over time really has been Bitcoin. So that's one side. Another side is, considering the historical, I guess, background of Nigeria and Nigerians in general versus the way we're treated globally in terms of global financial rails, has not been the most beneficial, really, for a lot of people, in the sense that a lot of the financial rails have closed off access to a lot of Nigerians, whether it's Visa, Mastercard, a lot of these things. So over time, the more the financial rails essentially have been closed off to a lot of Nigerians, the more that they seek out even more alternatives that provide them that ability to transact globally, instantly, and cheaply. And honestly, that has always come down to Bitcoin. And over time, we've seen, especially with the introduction of the Lightning Network through companies like BitNote, which have invested into Recursive Capital, we started seeing a lot more people understanding Bitcoin and seeing it as more of a medium of exchange rather than just a store of value, which was the initial use case a lot of people were exploring. So over time, I say the combination of both the failing currency, inflation, as well as understanding that Bitcoin is the only avenue for them to actually be participants on a global scale in terms of economics and commerce. I say those two things have been the main reasons why you tend to see high adoption rates for Bitcoin here on the continent, more so specifically in Nigeria. I think we probably lead in not only P2P markets, but just a lot of tumultuous economic situations really over the last, I'd say, maybe decade, and specifically the last 3 years.
Okay. What about like the rest of Africa? You don't see similar like dysfunctional currencies and you have like high adoption rates, or is there like something that stands out in Nigeria?
I'd say what stands out the most in Nigeria is just the sheer peer-to-peer market that we have, because I think not only do we lead globally, but we also lead here in the African continent. And a lot of that just has to do with, I feel, the translation of commerce from, the general fintech space or just the general economy into Bitcoin as a result of the free floating advantages really to using Bitcoin, which is allowing for individuals to participate on that level of global remittances or global flows. So a lot of them tend to provide, even on the B2B side, if they're looking to bring in materials on a wholesale level, they tend to use Bitcoin to settle a lot of that as opposed to like the US dollar or USDT or the national currency. So a lot of that has just been a translation of our existing economy, honestly, into the Bitcoin space. So that's why we tend to see a lot of sheer volumes really come out of Nigeria versus some other parts. And I say if you're contrasting it with other parts of Africa, what's interesting to note is obviously the sheer size of Africa, 54 countries, essentially having the West, the East, the North, the Central Africa, as well as South Africa. And each one, Bitcoin solves a particular, I'd say, use case or problem that they've had historically. So if we're looking at places like East Africa, you tend to see a lot more of the Bitcoin mining being a priority as a result of, honestly, I feel it kind of just translates the priorities on a governmental level for a lot of these places. So you tend to see a lot of these parts in East Africa focusing on green energy projects and energy infrastructure. So naturally, a lot of them tend to focus on some of the opportunities that Bitcoin provides. Hence why, Ethiopia is allowing and had been pioneering really Bitcoin mining on the continent, as well as Kenya's recent announcement with Marathon, which are enabling for them to kind of collaboratively manage their green energy infrastructure. Whereas here in West Africa, it's more a case of pure markets, really, for allowing for trade, commerce, and things like that. And I say the South is also similar. The North is kind of a bit complex in terms of how we view their trends, because they tend to be, I'd say, bundled up together with the Middle East as well. So it's difficult to kind of extrapolate specific data around Bitcoin trends. And I say Central African Republic, parts in Central Africa have been a bit difficult as well. But I think over time, we'll tend to see a lot more narratives around nationalizing or using Bitcoin as a tool for increasing their sovereignty at a national level as a result of, obviously the currencies that they have and the historical ties with France and things like that. So I think that's going to take a bit more time, because there are a lot more issues that are probably higher priorities as opposed to, the role of Bitcoin. But I do feel, given the conversations I've had with folks in those regions, that eventually that would be kind of the trends we should expect from those regions. So I'd say in general, that's how you should look at Africa in terms of the different trends. It just mimics a lot of the priorities on the government level, as well as what people on the ground are feeling with the results, as a result of, the economic situation that they have and things like that. And that also leads into regulation and how different countries view things. And a lot of that also involves translating and domesticating regulatory frameworks from, Europe, the EU, specifically the US, and things like that, especially in a country like Nigeria. So that's kind of what the dynamics are at play.
Okay, and now I would like to focus on what you're doing as an investor in this space. Why do you think, and why did you set up an investment fund to focus on investing in companies in the region? And what do you think there is in Africa in terms of companies building on Bitcoin that are doing it in a unique way compared to the rest of the world?
A lot. I mean, so over time, since 2020 to date, I've had to kind of synthesize more concretely over time the thesis on Recursive's end. But the general mission for me when I launched Recursive was one point really, which is to ensure that there is efficient allocation of capital on the continent, and specifically having folks on the ground that understand the trends like we've been discussing, the regulatory landscape, as well as kind of the general malaise that a lot of people, both on the development side as well as folks on the ground, feel. And then kind of combining all of that to form insights, novel insights really, to ensure that capital is efficiently allocated. So companies that require the capital actually get the capital, as opposed to the ones that make the most noise on the continent, which tends to be the case even if you look at, fintechs or the general investment ecosystem here in Africa. Now, over the years, I've come to understand a lot of the pain points and a lot of the differences, I'd say, between the African ecosystem versus other parts of the world, from both the entrepreneurial side as well as really just the general venture capital landscape and kind of the dynamics at play, sources of capital, just the general issues people have seen highlighted or are kind of experimenting with. So right now, the core thesis on our end is twofold. We're investing in Africa specifically and having that as our main focus because, one, we feel the development landscape is honestly second to none globally, and specifically in the Bitcoin space, where we're starting to see a lot more of the devs that come out of Africa be on not only the same level on a global stage with other developers from other parts, but actually leading a lot of the conversations. Because again, Bitcoin is very, very unique for a variety of reasons. Specifically in this context, we're looking at the resilience that it's allowing for and also ensuring that people have day one in terms of protecting their financial agency and things like that. But more so from a development standpoint, a lot of the frontier development moving forward in the next decade, 50 years, will be around protecting those guarantees, essentially, of making sure that people still have control of their full money at the protocol level, ensuring that people are not having any sort of choke point where they could lose control of their money, ensuring that at the next 50, 100 years, people that use Bitcoin will still have all these assurances that we tend to propagate to people when we're talking about Bitcoin in general. This is your money. No one can co-opt it. This is the sheer control that you have and the sheer power, honestly, and the consequences of having that type of open monetary network with interoperable tools that engage both in terms of a local level as well as being a conduit to opening up global markets finally in an actual, true, free, democratic way. So we're seeing a lot of that on the development side in terms of African leading. I think we're just going to keep.
You have a couple of companies you have invested in that you can give as an example of what you're saying?
Oh, definitely. And that's essentially the second point. We feel because a lot of these pain points will likely see the most purest definition of what a Bitcoin company is come out of Africa. So those are two reasons why you invest in Africa. Now, these companies range from the ones that we've seen invested in, specifically ones like BitNop, for example, which started off initially for just enabling, people to buy and sell Bitcoin, all the way up to morphing into allowing for and proliferating the DCA culture, so the dollar cost averaging for a lot of people to get into Bitcoin. We saw that trend mostly in, I'd say, 2021 to 2022 take off. And then by 2023, I'd say, or early 2022 was when they integrated the Lightning Network, being the first company in the continent to do so. And then the attendant benefits that we've seen from then to now has been kind of a mindset shift for a lot of people in terms of understanding that Bitcoin can actually be used on a daily basis. It's not a case where you have to buy a whole Bitcoin or maybe you need to move large volumes to kind of interact with the currency. So we've seen a lot of that in terms of the shift, but we've also seen a huge uptake in terms of people building on the Lightning Network. So specifically people that are involved in like gaming and things like that on the Lightning Network to move the perspective from just buying Bitcoin to actually earning Bitcoin on top, because that's another avenue for people to access Bitcoin more efficiently, as opposed to requiring them to generate a lot of wealth and then get into the space. So kind of lowering the barrier to entry on that end. And I say other companies too.
When you speak about gaming, like on Millennium Capital, we launched a Bitcoin Academy app where you win sats by learning Bitcoin. Is it these type of games where you play to win sats?
Yeah, exactly.
And stuff like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
So around that, and even just general things around, efforts from Thunder Games, or seeing a lot more participation from the African continent, people playing those games that allow them to earn sats over time. And I think a lot of that honestly would result in having larger amounts of folks that have access to Bitcoin, because we do have a large gaming ecosystem here in Africa. That is, I think, probably most prominent for folks that are familiar with the gaming space and gaming circles like CSGO, for example, or Call of Duty and things like that. So we'll definitely see a lot more uptake there. And I'd say in terms of the general landscape now, we're seeing a lot more diversity in terms of the companies that are coming out. Previously in 2018, it was strictly just exchanges and wallets that allow for buying and selling Bitcoin. But now we're at a stage where we're actually honestly leading as well globally in terms of green energy mining efforts, generally speaking, in terms of both state level mining as well as at least open legal frameworks for allowing for mining to take place, and all the way up to the point where we're also having a lot more innovation on the Lightning Network. We're still not there yet in terms of Nostr and kind of how that plays into the general landscape, but we're definitely seeing trends towards moving that. Because again, we're kind of in an iterative process of first discovering a lot of these technologies, allowing for interoperable tools to be built, and then getting to the point where people innovate on top of that as a result of seeing the potential of use cases that we have on top of that. So I think it's definitely going to be a lot more interoperable tools moving forward. And even other companies that have invested in, like Fedi, for example, that are more looking at the kind of the middle ground in terms of custody, ensuring that is more collaborative as opposed to full on self custody versus full on custodial services. So we're going to see a lot more interplay between a lot of the technologies that we have, even in terms of like eCash, Lightning, Nostr, all of that. So that's kind of the general state of development that we're in right now. And the companies that will likely come out will mimic a lot of these opportunities that we're seeing, slash the confluence of all these tools.
Okay, I'm gonna challenge a little bit what you just said, because I get this challenge myself when I talk about what we're trying to do in Europe. So I'm gonna give you the same challenge that I'm challenged upon. And the challenge is the following. When we saw the arrival of the internet, there was a lot of discussions about like it's gonna liberate an immense richness potential for Africa. And now Internet for all Africans will allow to end poverty and end misery and open like opportunities worldwide for all Africans that they didn't have access to before. But we ended up with Google, Facebook, Instagram, etc., all US based. And don't you think we're going to have the same with Bitcoin? That we're going to end up with US based companies catering for African, European, worldwide Bitcoin users and developers?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and one that I constantly think about, both in terms of just my understanding of the space and just engaging with it from a development standpoint as a developer, as well as on the investment side, slash when we're teaching developers. One thing I'd say that there are a couple of differences at play, in my opinion. I feel the issue with the internet that we saw was a huge divergence from what a lot of people would categorize as the initial founding principles of having an open global, honestly, information rail to allow for not only the proliferation, but the consumption as well as the contribution and kind of the widespread information kind of access and things like that. And then what we saw was the incentives over time kind of reflected very negative things in terms of the internet essentially evolved to incentivize walled gardens, essentially. Whereas with the Bitcoin space, I'd argue the difference here is because of a lot of the game theoretical aspects of both the protocol level as well as kind of the way in which we've interacted with it over time and kind of the guarantees at play and the dynamics, the incentives are completely different. And we've seen that really in a lot of ways, whether we're talking about, the kind of quote unquote first civil war we had essentially in 2017-18 with a lot of the hard forks. And over time, the more we see a lot more, again, like you mentioned, a lot of the companies that are coming out of the Western world getting further entrenched both in terms of mining or just building tools. And the one thing we come to realize is with Bitcoin, there isn't any sort of permissioned layer for people to participate in terms of moving the needle forward or engaging with the Bitcoin protocol itself or building tools. And a lot of the dynamics are around increased interoperability helps you survive in this space as opposed to closing off yourself and being the only person providing specific tools, services, and all that. The more you close off yourself in the Bitcoin space, the more you isolate yourself, the more you reduce the actual reach, honestly, that your product has. So it's inverted versus the way the internet works. Whereas the internet is more incentivized for companies to build all these gardens to ramp up, user bases and then kind of monetize on top of that. Whereas the Bitcoin space is kind of the opposite. The monetization is already there. All you're doing is plugging into an existing global financial rail. It allows for instant payments and things like that. And the only way you can actually win is provide the best service possible that interacts with other services. That's the only benefit that you can provide to people that stands out as opposed to saying you want to lock them out. So I feel the combination of the Bitcoin space and Nostr essentially would solve a lot of the issues. And we're seeing it solve a lot of the issues around monetizing without necessarily requiring users to sacrifice their own data, ensuring that there is a lot more sovereignty on the data level as well as the privacy level. And one thing I'd note in terms of just the general, I'd say, political implications too that we're talking about, because again, the internet brought a lot of things where, the more the companies expanded, the more they expanded into actual geographies where they wanted to either, take advantage, so to speak, of some of the energy dynamics in general. I see the Bitcoin space is kind of the opposite, really, where Bitcoin mining, I feel, would continue to increase the level of sovereignty, both at a state level as well as a continent level for Africa. Why? Because a lot of the issues that we had with regards to sovereignty have to do with a lack of resource independence or exploring resources independently by these countries. And even on the energy side, the moment a country has no energy sovereignty, essentially, a lot of the development that they'll have to engage in will be dependencies on IMF loans and things like that. So the Bitcoin mining, especially, what is going to allow, I feel personally, especially if done right, in the sense of not just allowing for foreign companies to come in to explore your energy rights and things like that, would be if you're able to harness all that extra energy through Bitcoin mining, and you plug in all those revenues or novel streams of income into the local economy, I feel that would get us to a point where a lot more countries will be closer to having full-on sovereignty, where they will stop thinking of deals and things that they engage with at a geopolitical level from the point of view of how do we balance not upsetting the powers that be that are essentially in charge of our resources versus introducing and inducing economic development. The case will be, okay, now that we have a lot of this energy independence, how do we actually engage more constructively and collaboratively, as opposed to having all these exploitative measures essentially put on us? So I feel it's very, very different in terms of the incentive mechanisms, the level of participation that Africans have in the ecosystem versus the internet. Just the general dynamics, I feel, with the opportunities that we now have for the first time in terms of exploring energy independence. I think all of that would really not only catalyze Africa for the first time and not just be a narrative that we've been having, that we've seen with the internet and other technologies, where we're not only just consuming as we have done with the internet, but we're actually leading and providing tools for other people around the world. So that's kind of how I square that circle, essentially. And I think about it in terms of the role Africa plays in the Bitcoin ecosystem.
I like your point of view about Bitcoin being community-based technology, whether the internet has a more centralized aspect. However, I will continue challenging you one more step, because again, going back to the internet example, what we have seen actually with the adoption of the internet is the quote unquote the Nigerian scam turned from paper to email and became much more widespread because of the cheapness of sending the message that you won $1 million or whatever, and then targeting these innocent people, whereas they used to do it by mail post, and now they can do it by email thanks to the internet. And now with Bitcoin, it's going to be like a new level of proliferation in Nigeria of the next level Nigerian scam, where you can get like a much easier transfer of money than what the traditional financial system allowed you to do, and the trickiness around it.
Yeah.
What do you have to answer about that?
Totally understandable. And I think those are valid concerns. I think whenever you solve economic challenges, or whenever you provide a solution that increases the efficiency of, economic tools, services, and all of that, you tend to also see the consequence of that is introduced efficiencies in terms of scams and people trying to engage in fraud or defrauding people. So I think that's just a given in terms of just how economics is and just the general dynamics of how it interplays with human beings. I think the difference, although, would be with Bitcoin, again, back to the incentive mechanisms. Like, the one thing I've noticed here on the ground, especially in Nigeria, I would say is, and especially even the state that I'm in, Kaduna, which is we're seeing a lot of people turn to all these nefarious activities to kind of be like, as a result of not having viable means to actually make legitimate income. So a lot of them that tend to scam just feel this is an easy and cheap way to essentially make money. And a lot of that tends to be obviously on the young folks who are looking to make money quickly, and obviously the rise of social media and kind of the way a lot of young folks view life in terms of, if you're not a billionaire by 20 years, you're kind of losing out. So there is that haste to kind of make money quickly, which honestly, the only ways you could make that type of money is through illegal ways. So I feel for a lot of them, the more we tend to see a lot more viable economic opportunities come out of the Bitcoin space as a result of the jobs that will be created that don't exist right now that we can discuss and explore. I feel a lot of the folks would feel naturally, as we've seen with honestly, even just the Bitcoin space and how it has evolved, they will start to see that as a more viable and constructive way to make money that doesn't involve all the risks that come with trying to defraud people, such as, jail time, death in some cases, depending on how illegal your activities are. I'll just give an example with regards to kind of how economics comes into play with, illegality versus legal means of exploring income. So we had an issue in the state I'm in where essentially there was a lot of, kidnapping, banditry and things like that. And what the state government decided to do was a lot of the folks that were coming in, the foreign companies, they decided to locate some of the factories in those high risk areas. And a lot of people are like, why would you do that? That would just increase, the likelihood of them getting kidnapped and things like that. But the argument from the state government's end was, if you introduce economic opportunities, people will be more incentivized to protect those opportunities and leverage that to actually engage in more productive means of, again, exploring income. And that's essentially what we saw. The companies came and built, and we saw a huge decrease in a lot of the banditry and kidnapping that was happening in that region because, again, when a lot of people were speaking to them on the ground, like, what changed? It was very simple. They're like, okay, previously we had no economic opportunities to engage with legally, and now we do. So there's an incentive to actually protect these means of income that we have, as opposed to engaging all these dangerous activities that could result in, again, death. So I think it's going to mimic the same trajectory really for us in Africa and Nigeria. It doesn't mean Africa, would not have scams or Nigeria would stop having scammers because Bitcoin came to solve that. I just feel a lot more of those folks that would have gone into scamming will be piped into more legal and legitimate ways of making money through Bitcoin, just by the sheer, I would say, qualitative difference in both the kind of income stream, the regularity of that income stream. Because again, a lot of these scams are just hit and miss, quick attempts at making money as opposed to viable, long-term, sustainable means. And I think that always wins out in terms of how humans just kind of take a look at and balance out a lot of the negatives and positives with regards to engaging in some of these activities. So that's kind of how I think of it, and I think things will kind of tread moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I find your answer quite convincing. I believe that what the internet missed is the opportunities to provide services to the world and getting paid for it, because it didn't have like the payment rails in place. You ended up focusing on the scamming part, and hopefully when you have the financial rails in place, it comes with economic prosperity and therefore less need of illegal activity to make a living, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks a lot for all these insights. It was a real pleasure talking to you, Abubakar. And good luck with your Bitcoin endeavor in Africa.
Thank you very much, Jad, for having me, and really appreciate the conversation.
Take care.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.